Good evening and welcome to Scotonomics, episode 19. My name is William Thompson, and on screen with me tonight I have Kairin Van Sweden. Hi Kairin, how are you doing?
I'm good, how are you?
Yes, very well. It's not like we've not seen each other 3 times already today. There's a lot, I'm sure you all know, there's a lot of effort goes into putting the show together. I think Kairin and I have both done about 3 or 4 hours today. We've had 2 fascinating interviews over the last couple of days with 2 incredible economists. We can't wait to bring you those shows in February. So apart from 3 or 4 hours on Scotonomics today, Kairin, what else have you been up to?
So, alas, the Pay to Pollute campaign did not succeed so far. The judge found against us. So we are thinking about whether we should go further and try and appeal. So that's a discussion we're having just now. But I spoke to a journalist today, and hopefully we can keep raising awareness about the issues involved with that. So yeah, that's been taking up a lot of my time, talking to the lawyers and studying the judgment from the judge. So yeah, I'm looking through that. So I've been quite busy with that.
And that announcement came through. Was it late last night, or is that just when I saw it?
Oh, 10:30 a.m. yesterday. Yeah, 10:30 a.m. yesterday. So
okay, so you've had a little bit of time to think about that judgment now. What's your first thoughts?
Yeah, it's just really disappointing, because you're hoping that you can really force the government to start being a lot more serious about climate change, which I don't think the UK government are serious enough, and I don't think they see it as the existential threat that it actually is. I think it's that thing of that's that grey rhinoceros running towards you on the plane. You see it coming, and then suddenly it's right in your face. And I think that's the thing about climate change. People know intellectually it's an existential threat, but they think that we can just keep getting away with doing what we're doing, and we've really got to start getting a lot more serious about it. And that really has to come from the currency issuer, I would say, which is the UK government.
Yeah. Well, it's been really good that you've been central to that campaign, and hopefully if this one doesn't work, it'll certainly raise issues around how much money the government actually doesn't earn from oil extraction, and when you weigh that up, that tiny amount of money that it's earning compared to the monumental and cataclysmic damage that it's causing, it's just, there's no way you can look at that and think that those in any way balance. So I know part of your work has been showing that that's actually the case. Anything else you've been doing? Anything else you want to talk about?
Yeah, so of course, always paying attention to the news, but the big thing in Scotland just now, of course, is the sell-off of the land offshore for wind energy. So reading a lot of different articles about that by different journalists, their thoughts about it. It's really interesting. So yeah, there's a lot to weigh up there. There's certainly a lot of people within the independence movement, they'd like to see it nationalised. I have questions about whether the income that comes from that will then be just taken away from the transfer from Westminster, how it will benefit the Scottish people. We expect to see cheaper energy bills. These kind of things are the questions that I've got. So I'm sure everyone else does too.
Yeah, it has been really interesting, and I've been trying to keep on top of that as well. It'd be great to hear what any of the people who are watching think about that. It was a big major announcement, not just for climate, but for the economy. And I think for me, it's a really important, we're at kind of crossroads. What do we do till we wait for independence? How is independence being factored into these decisions that we're making? Is that affecting a 5-year license compared to a 20-year license? Is it trying to get money now, or are we changing it in hope that we're going to get some more money later? These all things I think have to be thought about when you're looking at these kind of big decisions. But it leads in beautifully to what we're covering tonight, which is a carbon emissions land tax. So the first thing I'll do is welcome everyone properly to the show. This is the second week now that we've gone out, not just on YouTube, but on Facebook and on Twitter. So thanks very much to any new people who are watching. And please do comment. You can comment on Facebook and on YouTube. And it'd be really nice to hear hear from you. Thanks, Finlay, who's dropped us a note, and he's asking about, what about the people who live near these wind farms? Are they going to get a share of the money? Yeah, and I think that is a really important question, and it bleeds into what we're going to talk about tonight as well, about a carbon emissions land tax. Is, we're all going to have to do our bit to mitigate the climate crisis. Some people are going to have to do more than other people, and how is that redistributed? If you've got a bit of land that you can't use anymore for your whatever you normally do it on because it's been given over to plant trees, or you can't fish now, or these things because there's wind farm, this all has to be in the equation. So it's a really good question, Finlay. Just before we get started, just to let you know that we've actually got Nikki Gordon from the Join Muir Trust, who's going to be joining us on the live chat tonight. So any questions arise from anything that Nikki's saying, and it's a fascinating half an hour we've got for you, then ask her. You can ask her directly in the chat. Kairin, do you want to do a little introduction before I play the video?
Yeah, so Nikki Gordon, she's joined us from the Join Muir Trust, and she's just recently completed a Master's in Environmental Law. So this is a really interesting interview with Nikki tonight. So I hope you all enjoy it.
So do I, and here it comes. Hi, Nikki Gordon from the Join Muir Trust. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to speak about, in the main, a proposal that Join Muir Trust has around a carbon emissions land tax. Now, I came across this just before Christmas, and I thought it was fascinating, and we're really pleased that you're able to join us to talk a little bit more about it. Before we get into that particular proposal, I'd like to know a little bit more about the Join Muir Trust. Could you tell us a little bit about the organisation?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. So the Join Muir Trust, we are a UK-wide conservation charity. Our sort of main remit is to campaign to protect wild places, but we also sort of repair and rewild land that's in our care. And we aim to also enhance people's connection to nature through our Join Muir Award.
How much land do you have that you manage?
Well, in Scotland, we've got about 25,000 hectares, and I think 40,000 across the UK.
Okay, so quite a considerable land holding then. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about the carbon emissions land tax?
Yeah, so I mean, the carbon emissions land tax is a proposal that we developed, I suppose, in response to the climate and biodiversity emergencies that we're all aware of, and that the proposal itself is a way to explicitly link those climate solutions with land management. So the proposal calls for a tax on land holdings above a threshold of 1,000 hectares. And so we would assess these land holdings on their current or predicted carbon emissions, both negative or positive, and then their potential also for carbon sequestration. So each land holding would be placed into a sort of banded system, and then they'd have a different tax rate depending on the estimation of emissions. So the point of the tax at its core is basically to incentivize behavioral change. And we've seen this happen, numerous times. That taxes are tried and tested mechanisms for attaining particular policy goals, or discouraging harmful behavior, or I suppose inducing certain desired behaviors. And there's a few examples of this working, of taxes influencing behavior. The most famous being obviously the alcohol and tobacco taxes. But also more recently, there's been, the soft drinks levy, there's the plastic bag charge, which helped sort of remove millions of bags from circulation. And then there's also been the London congestion charge, which helps to cut carbon emissions and helps stop pollution and traffic congestion in London. So our sort of thought process was that we want a tax system that reflects the climate emergency, and I suppose on a broader and more spiritual scale to reflect our sort of cultural conscience, essentially taxing what we as a society feel is bad, or, incentivizing the good.
What are the behaviours that you hope to encourage with this tax?
There's a couple of ways to answer this question, I suppose. I can start with the reasons why we need this tax. Might be, why the land is important as to why we need this tax. So, I mean, in climate terms, I suppose land is the only natural source of carbon sequestration. That's through, woodlands and peatlands, but also other sort of native and natural habitats. And from a biodiversity perspective, natural habitats are really sort of integral to healthy ecosystems. So in Scotland, the official term for the land sector that I keep referring to is land use change and forestry, and that refers to sectors that centre around land management, the change from one land use category to another, for example, changing forestry plantations to restored woodlands or farmlands to housing estates, and then also the forestry sector, but that excludes agriculture. And one of the reasons why we developed this proposal is because we learned recently that the land sector is actually a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions. So more than Scotland's international aviation and shipping sector, which kind of means two things: that the land sector is, a net source of emissions, but it's also that the size of the carbon sink in Scotland, which is, the parts of the land that are soaking in carbon, are getting smaller. So in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees and for Scotland to achieve net zero, clearly there's a dramatic shift needed in the way that we use our resources. And specifically, we need to maximize carbon removal by natural ecosystems. So we calculated that if we restored damaged peatlands and expanded native woodlands, that could sequester almost 13 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, which is more emissions than the entire domestic transport sector, which is the highest emitting sector that we have. And so we like to say it's like the annual equivalent to removing all the cars from our roads, plus another 1 million tons. So it's a huge source of potential. And also it has to happen now. So these things, measures like planting trees and restoring peatlands, they can take decades to reach their maximum carbon sequestration potential. So we're really pushing for this to take hold sooner rather than later.
Yeah, well, we could also say it needed to happen 10, 20 years ago. And at the moment is the absolute latest that it can happen, to have these extra ways of sequestering carbon. So in terms of the behavioural change, through the tax, you're going to owners of land and saying, if you don't change the way that you manage land, you'll have to pay a tax. Is that how you would kind of summarize the proposal?
The idea, I suppose, came from, if you've ever seen those, energy performance certificates that you get on washing machines or when you buy a new house, for example, and that sort of summarizes the environmental performance of a building or an appliance or something like that, and gives it a grade based on its performance. So that's where the idea came from. We applied this concept to land carbon, and we thought, about the different methods for incentivizing the improvement of this rating, and that's where the tax came from.
So a couple of things. I think it's really great, actually, Nikki, that you've pointed out the point of tax really to incentivize and to change behaviours as well, because obviously in a fiat world, you don't really need to ring fence money, but in the Scottish Government context, that because it's not a currency issuer, it does to a certain degree rely on taxation. So that's a really interesting point, an important point that I think that you bring up as well, because my understanding of tax law is that it's so incredibly complex and such a specialised area that only a few people want to study it, because it's so complex, and it's a bit of a dark art as far as other law students are concerned as well. So that's really interesting as well. But the other thing I wanted to ask you as well was, who will champion this tax regime? How are you lobbying for this?
So that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, we've done a lot of consulting with experts when developing this proposal and, thinking about potential risks. And, we approached the Climate Change Committee, the James Hutton Institute, and then from the taxation perspective specifically, we asked for advice from the Chartered Institute of Taxation as well. We actually held a sort of talk during COP26 with the Scottish Ecological Design Association and the Chartered Institute of Taxation to sort of debate, the fairness and the efficiency and certain principles of the tax.
So I guess I want to know, how are you going to make this happen? Because obviously the legislator has to make this happen. So
Yes.
you can bring as an SNP member. I've brought policy to conference and it's been passed, but for it to actually happen, you have to have people in your party, perhaps even in other parties as well, who want to champion and bring bills forward. So how are you going to make that happen?
During COP26, we did this policy is new, it's less than a year old, this idea. And so we're really in the beginning stages right now. So we have gone to the point where we have consulted sort of some of the major stakeholders that we would see to be relevant to this, and try to maximize collaboration with that. But this is really much the start of the conversation. So our campaign at the moment is to raise awareness, which is why doing this show is really important. And we hope that we can get other people interested by spreading the word and seeing that this is a progressive change that could happen in land management.
But yeah, Kairin's hit the nail on the head there, isn't it? For the policy to have success, it has to be implemented by someone on the legislature, and it has to become the law. Is that the only way that we can make these policies successful, or is there any other kind of route where you could look at this in a few years and say we were successful, we didn't get it on the statute books, but we were successful in any other way?
Yeah, I mean, the point of this proposal in itself is to make change happen. So we also talked about whether maybe not a tax, but maybe we should put in some sort of a licensing system. We want to get results, and how we achieve that, we thought this tax is probably the easiest way to do that. But obviously implementation, as you say, and policy steps, it needs a lot of, this is the starting point for further discussion. So obviously there needs to be, parliamentary legislation and public consultation and all and debates and all this. But we think that if we start working on this now, at the level of Scottish Parliament, let's say, we could have this done by, let's say, 2025 and have a sort of 20-year run into the target date for net zero emissions.
I think what's great to see with them kind of top-down measures like this is to see the impact it can have on the bottom up. And it might be that the taxation is never needed because of the momentum that's around this proposal, that landowners start actually using, that you affect the behaviour that you want without actually ever having to implement it. So in a way, it would be great if you never have to do this, because landowners were doing it already. But it's a shame that we've got to look to this kind of mechanism to get the land use change that we like to do. I'd love to know a little bit more about your thoughts on land and land ownership in Scotland. And my first most obvious question is that if all this land was public, then we wouldn't need to tax it, because we'd be able to influence the people who we elect to make those changes. But that's not the case in Scotland. So what's your views around the ownership of land in Scotland?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the moment in particular, there's a lot of talk about green lairds specifically, which sort of focuses around these private and commercial interests buying up thousands and thousands of acres of land in rural Scotland and planting it with trees and thinking that is enough to reach net zero. I believe that this issue doesn't really tackle the social underlying problems, and it's really just replacing one problem with another. There's obviously historic social injustice in land ownership patterns in Scotland, and what's happening now might possibly lead to a lack of ambition on actually reducing emissions rather than just like offsetting carbon. So that's why, I mean, this tax specifically could form part of the land market regulations that are happening, and also on top of that could provide a source of income for communities, especially those ones looking to undertake those climate and nature restoration activities.
Because that's within your proposal, isn't it? That the tax would kind of be, I think, ring-fenced might be the right way to do it, but the tax would be ring-fenced for further kind of nature or environmental actions.
Yeah, we see that. We propose that the revenues raised from this tax should be ring-fenced for communities, and that can help sort of those smaller scale landholders, even, for example, to help them bear some of that, the brunt of those climate change targets that they have to reach, but also help community landowners in purchasing land, maybe if that's how they want to spend the revenue. But I think that this can have a double effect of not only convincing landowners to change their behaviour, but also supporting others in who wouldn't be regulated by these measures.
To paraphrase Mark Twain, one of the issues with land is that they're not making any more of it. So when we're looking at land use, especially in Scotland, we need to think about how we use that for other things. And for example, hiving off a huge part of Scotland for carbon sequestration has issues on what communities are able to use that land for, and where we're building new homes and houses, and also agriculture. Now, I know you said it doesn't affect agriculture at the moment, but that's obviously an alternative land use for people who are going into this idea of carbon sequestration. How do we kind of balance all of that? I know it's a really difficult question to ask you, but have you thought about that in terms of saying to people, this is what we want you to do, considering the other potential land use?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of things that we've been thinking about to answer the question in a sort of from a few different angles. I mean, the great thing about Scotland is that we have a lot of land, especially compared to the size of our population. We've got 6.5 times as much land per head as in England, for example. And then the majority of this land, or a lot of this land in the north, is what they call agriculturally less productive. So land that isn't suitable for agriculture anyway. And historically, they would have been these massive, vast swathes of pristine native woodlands that would have been carbon sequestering, and they would have, been peatlands. So in terms of the land that we have, a lot of it's not being used effectively. So, I mean, in terms of agriculture specifically, I think 93% of the land that's currently used for agriculture is smaller than 1,000 hectares anyway. So they the tax wouldn't have affected them. But the land use debate more widely is a difficult one to answer. But we really see the tax as becoming part of that conversation and helping to make the transition to net zero and land fair. As I said before, the potential for land is enormous. It's a third of all Scotland's total carbon emissions could be sequestered if we just restored all the land that we currently have. So the potential is enormous.
I think it's really important, the point that you make about subsidiarity and the taxation going to the local communities as well. I mean, I recently got a resolution through at the SNP conference on a job guarantee, and we very much see that as something that will be devolved down into communities, and communities would run that scheme. So I'm interested to know how you see your tax proposals as perhaps positively affecting populations in more rural aspects of Scotland. Have you thought about that, and can you perhaps paint a vision of that for us?
We think that the potential for the tax could not only be to raise revenues for communities, as I said, but there's also the potential for job creation, particularly in these rural areas, particularly in the conservation sector. And we really think that could complement some of the repeopling ambitions that we have for the Highlands. And so there's sort of the numerous benefits that this tax can help. It's not just a nature and climate tax, it's a tax that could have serious benefits for job creation and land management, and then also the various public benefits that come from restoring native habitats, more resilient ecosystems, improved soil fertility, which can save communities costs, reduce flooding, but also, improving outdoor experiences for people, which can help their mental and their physical health. So the benefits are endless.
And I wonder if you've got this figure, but we're talking about this amount of land that could fall under the tax. Have you any idea what percentage of that land is kind of classed as either kind of deer forests or space open for grouse shooting?
We don't have the specific figures for the differentiation of land types, but we do have the amount of land that the tax could potentially cover. So obviously there's serious land ownership concentrations in Scotland, as is made famous by Andy Whiteman's, 450 people own half of Scotland or something like that. But we estimated, based on 2014 2014 figures that there would only be 750 odd estates that would be covered by the threshold of 1,000 hectares. And that's about 40,000 square kilometres of privately owned land. And I think it's 12,000 kilometres of government agency and NGO owned land, people like JMT and Nature Scott. So 754 estates, and a lot of these large landowners are using these estates for things like deer shooting estates and driven grouse shooting. So this would help those sort of more depleted landscapes that occur because of the issues that stem from keeping these unsustainably high densities of one particular species. And the problem is that, for deer management specifically, there's no natural predators, so they're eating all the little saplings, so they can't grow into trees that would sequester carbon. And then for grouse shooting, the estates, they exacerbate climate change, not only through, burning of moorland, which releases carbon and damages peat soils, but also because of that additional aspect of illegal persecution of birds of prey, and various sort of monoculture issues that stem from them.
Well, my question was because I really wanted to make it clear that this is a tax that directly affects those types of land use that are not particularly popular in Scotland and are exclusive for people of a particular level of wealth. And I think that's really important to highlight this. It is a tax that's looking to hopefully change behaviour and land use quite substantially, but within not a specific target, but certainly targets those couple of uses, the deer forests and also the grouse. When we're talking about land, what we really need to think about, not just a carbon sequestration, but it's also the benefits of having these types of natural resources for the public benefit. Has that come into any kind of consideration within the tax?
People in Scotland go to the Highlands and they see these beautiful moors and glens, and they don't understand what is missing from those landscapes. And so our sort of through the tax, but also our wider sort of Join Muir Trust objective is to help people reconnect with what actually is wild land and how it's perceived by people. And so the tax complements our ambitions as a wider sort of charity as well.
Yeah, because I think that's a very positive benefit of any kind of change in behaviour, is that you're changing the land and you're hopefully democratizing the access to that land, but also the potential for enjoyment of that land, and also the kind of products, the non-timber products and other products that come from these types of natural resources as well, can completely change what a community does and how we manage our resources. Well, I'd like to finish on your vision and your idea for a net zero Scotland. Our target's 2045. You're the carbon officer at Join Muir Trust. We're only talking 22 years away. You might be in that role. You might have got to do something else, but it's certainly within your job expectancy. Where do you think we will be in 2045 as a nation? And how much of an important role do you think land will play in achieving or not achieving those targets?
Yeah, well, I think land, as I've said, has the biggest potential for helping Scotland in achieving our goals as a net zero country. And our tax proposal is sort of a recognition of the value of that land that we have in tackling the climate emergencies and also the biodiversity emergencies. And so we think that this policy will not only deter and reduce emissions and inappropriate land use, but it's also going to incentivize behavioural change amongst landowners who are not really taking their share of the responsibility for delivering on climate targets proportionate to their ability to do so. And so we sort of recognise that maximising natural carbon capture on land is going to have additional benefits for wildlife and nature, but also for the wider Scottish economy, and in particular in rural areas. So we hope that the Trust is trying to play its part in helping drive forward progressive change in the land management sector as stewards of wild land in Scotland.
And do you feel a 2045 target is achievable, realistic, unlikely?
I'm hopeful. I try to stay optimistic. Scotland is certainly a leader in that area, and the current government are doing, saying all the right things. However, whether that translates into action is yet to be seen. But I do have hope that if not 2045, at least by 2050, we'll achieve some sort of semblance of net zero. But this really is going to take systemic change in order to make this happen. And so I think wider financial policies like this tax are really important to help drive the more sort of individual change that we need on a more localized level.
You've completed a master's in environmental law as well, and I read a paper by a lecturer at Glasgow Caledonian. Basically, what she was saying as a law lecturer was that the law enables a lot of economic nefariousness. The most obvious one being that corporations are regarded as humans, as people. Do you think that environmental law, for example, I've also just read a paper yesterday by Ben Franta, and you might know that I'm involved in the pay to pollute case, where we've taken the UK government to court over their stand on maximum economic recovery. So a couple of things. Law, how can it be utilised to have a positive effect on economic justice? That's really what, and environmental justice as well.
It's a really good question, and I like the comparison of law using sort of people, companies as people. And I mean, humans have a tendency to personify things that we can't sort of wrap our head around in that way. And I think that law is really a way that we can, put value on things in society, and the law sort of reflects the human side of that. And I think that's why something like this tax policy, which policies obviously have an effect on law in the longer term, that can help to raise the profile of environmental actions in that wider society.
Yeah, absolutely.
To achieve a net zero world of 2045, 2050, I mean, we're going to need, as Professor Tim Jackson summarises it, a massive technological shift, a significant policy effort, wholesale changes in patterns of consumer demand, a huge international drive for technological transfer to bring about substantial reductions, and resource intensity right across the world. That's just to achieve net zero 2045 and 2050. So when we're looking at ideas like this, which are fantastic, how do you feel the likely impact that something like this is going to have, considering the fundamental changes that we have to make to achieve net zero?
Well, I mean, this is obviously not the only answer that we think that should be implemented, but I agree there needs to be a sort of package of measures to help us achieve this really fundamentally demanding goal of net zero. We not only individually need to, change the way that we behave and act and buy things, but more widely, there needs to be a huge shift, systemic shift in the way that we use resources across all of our sectors. And land is one of those sectors that is being considered, but it's, in my opinion, one of the more important ones, because it's not only something that needs to be, emissions need to come down from, it also has the potential to sort of soak up all the emissions that are unavoidable in that net zero goal. So yeah, we see this as one package of many measures that help to, and specifically with regards to the economy and financial measures, to help show what we think is valuable in society and reflect those sort of more cultural values.
Well, in Scotland, more than most other countries, because of her historic relationship with access to land and ownership of land, I do feel that this is an area that Scotland could and should lead on, and making sure that the land is actually taking a proactive part in the climate crisis. And I'm really, it's been really pleasing to see your proposals in a little bit of detail. I wish you all the luck with them. I hope to see a lot more detail in the coming months, and it would be great if we can get, as Kairin and yourself highlighted earlier, if we can get a champion within the Scottish Legislature to pick this up. We know a lot of MSPs watch the show, so please, if you are interested, please do get in touch with Nikki at the Join Muir Trust. Nikki, thank you very much for your time. It's been fascinating hearing about all your efforts, and best of luck. And we'd love to have you back on in 6 months' time to find out where we are with the proposal.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's been great.
Thanks. Bye now.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
And we're back. Thanks so much, everyone. Lots of comments from Facebook and from YouTube. So thank you so much for your engagement. And thanks to Nikki, who was busy scribbling away with the responses. I tried to chip in a little bit, Nikki. I hope that was okay. I knew there was a lot of questions coming in for you. What did you think, Kairin, watching that back?
Yeah, I think it was great the way Nikki highlighted the aspect of taxation that's about behavioural change, and then really in a country that runs its own currency, that's really what it's all about. We're not in that situation in Scotland, but if you are a currency issuer, that's really what taxes are for. And also that she highlighted just how much emissions come from the land as well. And that huge potential to remove 13 million tonnes of CO2, more than the domestic transport system. Fascinating, really interesting.
What I really liked about this, and what I found really interesting, was trying to trace where these proposals come from and how they get onto the statute book. And you had that really good question about who is going to be the influencer. And I think that's really interesting. It kind of proves that anyone can have a good idea. We're in a democracy. You can have an idea, get people to support it, whether it's through a political party or an organisation like Join Muir Trust. But I think it's been fantastic that they've been able to develop this policy and pitch it effectively to politicians and to other groups who look to support it. So I thought that was fascinating, and we'd love to bring more of these proposals. I know there's lots around the green economy and circular economy and a whole range of other policy proposals out there, and it's really good that we can bring these things hopefully to an interested audience.
Yeah, I mean, the other good one as well that we had, I thought, especially for the Scottish Government, was Diana from Bristol as well, and her idea for Bristol Pay. I thought that was a fantastic one. The other thing that was brought up in this episode as well was that concept of subsidiarity, which we discussed earlier today, and how that really fundamentally goes to the heart of why we want independence, both you and I, is that aspect of subsidiarity and how important that is, and that's built into her idea. And along with that, the vision of job creation and benefit for all communities.
We've had some brilliant comments and a couple of questions from Finlay, and here's one that I think will resonate with you, because we were speaking about subsidiarity today, which is this idea that the decision is best made as close to the people who it directly affects, and we were talking about the influence of the Central Belters, I think you called them earlier when we were speaking about it. And I said to Finlay, this will probably resonate with you. So what do you think about that? Do you think Scotland is very much focused from and on the Central Belt?
No, not entirely. I think some regions outside the Central Belt are better represented than others. So no, I wouldn't agree with that entirely. But of course, where the majority of people, well, I mean, it's not actually the majority of people don't live in the Central Belt. I think actually the majority of people live out with the Central Belt, when you really look at the figures. But, if they're all conglomerated, then it's easier for them to perhaps influence policy in that situation. But I think also as well, now that we've all embraced Zoom, the opportunity to work across Scotland with like-minded people across Scotland is something that, certainly we've embraced in the SNP for sure.
Okay, great. And a comment from Andy, who's on his son's YouTube access, I think. So it's quite positive response from Andy there. And I definitely do think it plays into this strong narrative about taking much more control of not just who owns the land, but what happens on that land. So I do think it ties into that that narrative really strongly. I'll see if we've got anything else. Yeah, see, I mean, I think this is a genuine. I know you've kind of said maybe not to the same extent as Finlay, but I do think this is a narrative. I see this narrative when I live in Spain, and I see this narrative in Madrid. But when I go to like Figueres or outside of, they talk about it being Barcelona that's making all the decisions. So it re-emphasizes your point about subsidiarity, and absolutely, Finlay, the decisions made with wind farms and land sequestration and houses and jobs and stuff should be made much more by the local community. And we hope that when we do get independence, that no one loses sight of that it is all about having the decisions made as close to people like yourself in where you are and everyone else who's around the country.
Yeah,
but
I mean, I'd like to also highlight as well for Finlay, we had a resolution at conference which was put forward by Tim, one of our guests, about, when we become independent, ensuring that the civil service is spread around the country as it is in other normal countries. Not the UK.
Yeah, normal. Well, thanks very much for joining us this evening. If you are a patron of ours, then you get these episodes a few days before we show them live, and you also get the audio, so the podcast version, and there's some other things on there as well. And all the revenue that comes from our Patreon helps us do things like this and spend the time to put all these shows together, but also help us fund a couple of really big documentaries we've got coming up this year, and also some live events. So please do, if you can, support us through Patreon. But we will always be here free on a Wednesday, and we're now here every week until, I don't know, either you and I collapse or something worse happens. But we really appreciate your support. So please do share what we're doing. Drop us a comment on either Facebook or YouTube. And if you've got any suggestions for people or things for us to cover or people to talk to, then please do let us know. Thanks very much for all your comments and all your interaction tonight. It makes a big difference to us. So we do appreciate that. Kairin, any final words before we say goodbye?
Yeah, just want to say thanks to all the people who have become patrons over the past week. So it's hugely encouraging, and we feel like, people believe in what we're doing. So that matters as well. So thanks very much for the people that have become patrons.
And thanks for everyone watching this evening. Next week, we have a wonderful interview we did with a lovely American lady about banking deserts. And it's quite a bit about America, but it's a universal problem, and we obviously pulled that back as much as we could to Scotland and the United Kingdom. But a really interesting interview, and we hope you can join us for that.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye now.
Thank you. Good night.